The relentless New Mexico sun beat down on the endless expanse of sand and scrub brush like the wrath of an angry god, turning the air into a shimmering furnace that made each breath feel like swallowing fire. Grace Whitfield stumbled forward on blistered feet, her once blue dress now the color of dust and desperation, while 4-year-old Tommy clung to her back with arms that trembled from exhaustion. In her aching arms, she carried 18-month-old Lucy, whose fevered whimpers had grown weaker with each passing hour, and beside her, 6-year-old Emma walked with the grim determination of a child forced to grow up too quickly. 3 days ago, they had been passengers on the Santa Fe-bound stage, Grace accompanying her sister's children to their new home after cholera had taken both parents in the span of a week. The stage had broken down 20 miles from the nearest settlement, and when the driver and guard had ridden ahead for help, promising to return within hours, Grace had settled in to wait with the children and the other passengers, but help had never come. The other passengers, 2 traveling salesmen and an older woman, had grown increasingly agitated as the hours stretched into a full day. When the salesmen announced their intention to walk to the nearest town, Grace had begged them to take the children, but they had refused with the cold calculation of men who valued their own survival above moral obligation. "You're welcome to come along," one had said with feigned generosity, "but we can't be slowed down by children. We'll send help back when we reach civilization." Grace had known it was a lie even as she watched them disappear into the desert shimmer. Men who would abandon children in the wilderness were not men who would risk their own safety to organize rescue parties. When the older woman had departed the following morning with similar promises and similar dishonesty, Grace found herself alone with 3 children in a broken stagecoach in the middle of nowhere. She had waited one more day, hoping against hope that someone would return for them. But as Lucy's fever climbed and their water supply dwindled, Grace realized that salvation would not come to them. They would have to find it themselves. So she had gathered what little food and water remained, fashioned a sling for Tommy from her petticoat, lifted Lucy into her arms, and begun walking east toward where she believed the nearest settlement lay. Now, on their 3rd day of walking, Grace could feel her strength ebbing like water from a cracked vessel. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her tongue swollen in her mouth, and every step sent jolts of pain through legs that had forgotten what it felt like to be anything but exhausted. But it was the children's suffering that truly broke her heart. Emma, the eldest, tried so hard to be brave, never complaining about her thirst or the pebbles that had worn holes in her thin shoes. Tommy, usually a chatterbox full of questions and observations, had grown quiet and listless, his small body conserving energy for the simple act of breathing. And Lucy, precious Lucy, barely more than a baby, burned with fever and seemed to fade a little more with each hour that passed. Grace had no idea if they were walking toward salvation or deeper into the wilderness. The desert all looked the same, endless rolling hills of sand and sage, punctuated by the occasional twisted tree or pile of red rocks that offered no shelter from the merciless sun. She had been following what looked like old wagon ruts, but they were so faint and weathered that she couldn't be sure they weren't just patterns created by wind and erosion. "Aunt Grace," Emma said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I'm so thirsty." Grace's heart clenched as she looked down at her eldest niece, this brave little girl who had been trying so hard not to be a burden. They had finished the last of their water at dawn, and Grace had been rationing it so carefully that none of them had had a proper drink in 2 days. "I know, sweetheart," Grace managed, her own voice hoarse and cracked. "We'll find water soon, I promise." It was a promise she had no idea how to keep, but she couldn't bear to let hope die in Emma's eyes. The child had already lost her parents, her home, everything familiar and safe in her short life. Grace would lie to the devil himself if it would keep Emma walking just a little longer. They crested another low hill, and Grace felt her heart sink as she saw more of the same endless landscape stretching before them. But then Emma gasped and pointed toward the horizon. "Aunt Grace, look! Is that smoke?" Grace squinted against the harsh light, trying to focus on what Emma had spotted. There, perhaps 2 miles away, a thin column of white smoke rose straight up in the still air, smoke that spoke of campfires, of human presence, of the possibility that they were not as alone as they had feared. "Yes," Grace breathed, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. "Yes, Emma, that smoke, that means people." But even as hope flared in her chest, Grace knew they faced a terrible irony. The smoke represented their only chance of survival, but she wasn't sure they had the strength to reach it. Lucy was burning with fever, Tommy could barely hold his head up, and Grace herself was running on nothing but will and desperation. "Can we make it?" Emma asked, displaying the unsettling maturity that tragedy had forced upon her. Grace looked at the distance remaining, calculated her dwindling strength against the children's needs, and made the decision that had been building in her heart for the past hour. "You and I can make it," she told Emma with as much confidence as she could muster. "But I need you to be very brave and help me with something important." Emma nodded solemnly, ready to take on whatever responsibility Grace asked of her. "I'm going to leave Tommy and Lucy here in the shade of these rocks," Grace explained, gesturing toward a small outcropping that offered the only shelter visible. "You and I will walk to that smoke as fast as we can and bring back help. It's the only way we can save them." Emma looked back at her younger siblings with the expression of someone weighing an impossible choice. "What if something happens to them while we're gone? Then at least we tried everything we could," Grace said gently. "But if we all try to walk that far together, we might all collapse before we reach help." It was the hardest decision Grace had ever made, leaving 2 sick children alone in the desert while she and Emma attempted to reach the distant smoke. But it was also the only decision that offered any hope of survival for all of them. She settled Tommy and Lucy in the meager shade, using her shawl to create additional protection from the sun and leaving them with soothing words and promises of swift return. Tommy was too weak to protest, and Lucy was barely conscious, but Emma kissed both of them goodbye with the solemnity of someone who understood that they might not see each other again. "Come on, sweetheart," Grace said, taking Emma's small hand in hers. "Let's go find help." The walk toward the smoke was the longest 2 miles of Grace's life. Without the burden of carrying the younger children, she and Emma were able to move faster, but the sun was climbing toward its noon zenith, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Emma stumbled frequently, and Grace found herself practically dragging the little girl across the unforgiving terrain. As they drew closer to the source of the smoke, Grace began to make out details that filled her with both hope and apprehension. The smoke was indeed coming from a campfire, and there were several figures moving around what appeared to be a temporary encampment. But even at a distance, she could see that these were not the white settlers or travelers she had been hoping to encounter. The camp was clearly Native American, Pawnee by the look of their dress and the style of their temporary shelters. Grace had heard enough stories about Indian raids and captivity to know that approaching a Pawnee camp with a white child might be walking into greater danger than they were already facing in the desert. But as Emma stumbled beside her, her small face red with heat exhaustion and her breathing becoming labored, Grace realized that they had moved beyond the luxury of choice. Whatever awaited them in that camp, it had to be better than certain death in the wilderness. "Emma," she said, stopping to kneel beside her niece, "I need to tell you something important about the people we're going to meet." Emma looked up with eyes that seemed too old for her 6-year-old face. "They're Indians, aren't they?" Grace nodded, impressed once again by the child's perceptiveness. "Yes, they are. And I know you've probably heard stories that make you frightened of Indian people. But right now, they're our only hope of getting help for Tommy and Lucy." "Will they hurt us?" Emma asked with the directness of childhood. "I don't know," Grace answered honestly, "but I do know that we'll all die if we don't ask for their help, so I need you to stay close to me and be very polite and respectful no matter what happens." Emma nodded with the grim acceptance of someone who had already seen too much of life's harsh realities. "I understand, Aunt Grace." As they approached the camp, Grace could see that her arrival with Emma had been noticed. Several figures had stopped their activities and were watching their approach with the careful attention of people accustomed to evaluating potential threats. Grace raised her hands in what she hoped was a universal gesture of peaceful intent and continued walking slowly toward the camp. The Pawnee band consisted of about 20 people, men, women, and children, who appeared to be traveling together, possibly on a hunting expedition or seasonal migration. Their leader, an older man with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, stepped forward to meet Grace and Emma as they reached the edge of the camp. He spoke to Grace in his own language, his tone cautious but not hostile. When Grace shook her head to indicate that she didn't understand, he switched to careful English. "Why do white woman and child walk alone in desert?" he asked, his accent thick but his meaning clear. Grace felt tears of relief at hearing any human voice willing to engage with her, rather than simply shooting or fleeing. "Please," she managed, her voice cracking with exhaustion and desperation. "We need help. There are 2 more children, babies dying back there. Please help us." The Pawnee leader studied Grace's face, taking in her obvious exhaustion, her sunburned skin, the desperation in her eyes. Then he looked down at Emma, who was clinging to Grace's skirt but meeting his gaze with remarkable courage for such a young child. "Where are children?" he asked. Grace pointed back in the direction they had come, toward the rocks where she had left Tommy and Lucy. 2 miles, maybe less. They're sick, burning with fever. I didn't think they could walk this far." The leader spoke rapidly to several other members of his band in their own language. Grace couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the tone of urgent discussion, of people weighing options and making decisions that would affect all their lives. Finally, the leader turned back to Grace. "I am Chief Running Bear. You come to our fire, drink water, rest. We send warriors to bring children." Grace felt her knees buckle with relief as the full meaning of his words hit her. "You'll help us. You'll save them. Children should not die in desert," Running Bear said simply. "White children, Indian children. No difference to the spirits who watch over the young." What followed was unlike anything Grace could have imagined, based on the stories she had heard about Indian captivity and violence. The Pawnee women immediately took charge of Grace and Emma, providing them with water, food, and shelter from the sun, while the men prepared to ride out in search of Tommy and Lucy. Grace tried to describe the location where she had left the children, but her exhaustion and the sameness of the desert landscape made it difficult to provide useful landmarks. Finally, one of the younger warriors, a man who appeared to be in his 20s with intelligent eyes and confident bearing, suggested that Grace ride with him to guide them to the exact spot. "My name is Swift Arrow," he told her in English. That was considerably better than Chief Running Bear's. "I can track White Woman's trail backward to children, but better if you come, make sure we find right place." Grace looked at Emma, who was already being cared for by the Pawnee women, with a gentleness that contradicted everything she had been taught about savage Indians. The little girl seemed to understand intuitively that she was safe, and she nodded encouragingly at Grace. "Go get Tommy and Lucy," Emma said, with the wisdom of someone far older than her years. "I'll be fine here." The ride back across the desert was both the longest and shortest hour of Grace's life. Sitting behind Swift Arrow on his horse, she was able to cover the distance in a fraction of the time it had taken her and Emma to walk, but every minute felt like an eternity as she worried about what they would find when they reached the rocks where she had left the children. Tommy and Lucy were exactly where Grace had left them, huddled in the shade of her shawl, but both children were clearly in worse condition than when she had departed. Tommy was barely conscious, and Lucy's fever seemed to have climbed even higher. Swift Arrow dismounted and immediately began assessing the children's condition with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to dealing with medical emergencies in harsh conditions. He lifted Lucy carefully, noting her labored breathing and the heat radiating from her small body. "Children very sick," he told Grace, as he helped her mount behind him again while cradling Lucy. "But not too late. Our medicine woman has healing skills." The return journey to the camp was a blur of anxiety and hope. Grace held Tommy while Swift Arrow managed both the horse and Lucy, the small girl's fevered body limp against his chest. When they reached the camp, Grace found that the Pawnee had already prepared a shelter and treatment area for the sick children. What followed was Grace's introduction to a completely different approach to medicine and healing than anything she had experienced in white settlements. The Pawnee medicine woman, an elderly figure called Crow Feather, worked with herbs, chants, and techniques that seemed to address not just the children's physical symptoms, but their spiritual state as well. "White medicine treats sickness," Swift Arrow explained, as Grace watched Crowfeather work over Lucy and Tommy. "Our medicine treats whole person, body, spirit, connection to world around them." Grace had been raised to view such practices as heathen superstition, but as she watched Tommy's breathing ease and Lucy's fever begin to break under Crowfeather's care, she found herself reconsidering many of the assumptions she had carried about Native American culture and capabilities. Over the 3 days that followed, as the children slowly recovered under Pawnee care, Grace experienced a complete transformation in her understanding of the people she had been taught to fear. The band was organized, sophisticated, and governed by complex social structures that emphasized collective responsibility and care for the vulnerable. Emma, freed from the responsibility of helping care for her younger siblings, blossomed under the attention of the Pawnee children, who seemed to accept her presence without question or prejudice. She learned games, picked up words in their language, and displayed the resilience of childhood in adapting to circumstances that would have challenged many adults. "Your children are strong," Chief Running Bear observed, as he and Grace watched Emma playing with a group of Pawnee girls. "They have survived much, learned to help each other. They're not my children," Grace corrected automatically, then realized how strange that must sound given the obvious bond between her and the 3 siblings. I mean, they're my sister's children. Their parents died, and I was taking them to family in Santa Fe when our stage broke down. Running Bear studied her face with the penetrating gaze she had learned to associate with people who had been forced to become excellent judges of character for survival purposes. You carry children who are not yours through desert, risk death to save them. What is difference between your children and sister's children? Grace considered his question, thinking about the past week of fear, exhaustion, and desperate love that had driven her to attempt the impossible for 3 children who shared her blood, but not her immediate responsibility. I suppose there isn't any difference, she admitted. They needed someone to care for them, and I was the only family they had left. Good answer, Running Bear said with approval. Shows you understand what family really means. It was Swift Arrow who eventually raised the question that Grace had been trying not to think about: what would happen when the children were well enough to travel? You still plan to go to Santa Fe? He asked, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and purple. Grace had been avoiding this question because she wasn't sure she knew the answer anymore. The family in Santa Fe, her sister's husband's relatives, had agreed to take the children out of obligation rather than love. They were strangers who had never met Emma, Tommy, or Lucy, people who had seen the children as burdens to be managed rather than blessings to be cherished. I don't know, she said honestly. That was the plan, but now, after everything we've been through together, after seeing how they've suffered and how brave they've been, I'm not sure I can just hand them over to people who don't really want them. Swift Arrow nodded, as if her answer made perfect sense. What would you do instead? Grace looked around the Pawnee camp, thinking about the past few days and how dramatically they had changed her understanding of what was possible, what family could mean, what home could look like. I don't know that either, she admitted. I have no money, no home, no husband to help support 3 children. But I also know that I love them, and they love me, and sometimes that has to be enough to build on. Sometimes that is more than enough, Swift Arrow said quietly. Over the following days, as the children continued to recover, and Grace found herself settling into the rhythms of Pawnee camp life, she began to understand that Swift Arrow's interest in her situation went beyond simple hospitality. He was a widower, she learned, whose wife had died in childbirth 2 years earlier, taking their unborn child with her. He had been living with the grief of that loss, focusing on his responsibilities as a warrior and hunter while avoiding thoughts of remarrying or starting a new family. Your children remind me that there are different ways to become a father, he told Grace one evening as they watched Emma teaching Tommy and Lucy a game she had learned from the Pawnee children. Children do not have to share your blood to share your heart. Grace felt her own heart skip at the implications of his words. Over their days together, she had come to admire Swift Arrow's kindness, his intelligence, his gentle way with the children, but the idea that he might be considering a future that included her and the children seemed too wonderful and too complicated to be real. Swift Arrow, she said carefully, I need you to understand something about my situation. I'm not just a woman traveling with children. I'm a white woman who would be marrying into a Pawnee band, bringing white children into your community. That would create complications for everyone involved. Swift Arrow smiled at her directness. You think we have not considered this? You think Chief Running Bear has not spoken with elders about what it would mean to have white family members? Grace stared at him in surprise. You've already discussed this with the tribe? We discuss everything that affects band, Swift Arrow replied matter-of-factly. Your presence here, children's presence, possibility that you might stay, all of this requires careful consideration. And what was the conclusion? Swift Arrow's smile widened. Conclusion was that woman who would risk death to save children, who shows respect for our ways and gratitude for our help, who brings happiness to our children and healing to our community. Such woman would be welcome addition to our family. Grace felt tears gather in her eyes at the unexpected acceptance, the possibility of belonging that she had never dared to imagine. And the children? Children who learn our games, show curiosity about our stories, adapt to our ways with open hearts. Such children are gifts from the spirits, Swift Arrow said with certainty. They would be raised as Pawnee, but they would also remember white world they came from. This could be valuable for our people as both worlds change and must find ways to live together. The proposal, when it came, was both formal and deeply personal. Chief Running Bear called a council meeting where Grace and the children were formally invited to join the band as permanent members. Swift Arrow spoke eloquently about his desire to marry Grace and adopt Emma, Tommy, and Lucy as his own children. The other band members shared their observations about the positive impact the family had already made on their community. "We offer you choice," Chief Running Bear told Grace when the formal presentations were complete. "You can continue to Santa Fe as planned, and we will provide escort and supplies for safe journey. Or you can stay with us, become part of our family, help us build bridges between our people and yours." Grace looked at the faces surrounding her, people who had saved her children's lives, who had welcomed strangers with generosity and kindness, who were offering her not just survival, but belonging. Then she looked at Emma, Tommy, and Lucy, who had found happiness and security among the Pawnee that they had never known in the white world. "What do you want to do?" she asked the children, because ultimately the decision affected them more than anyone. Emma, speaking for all three with the authority of the eldest, said simply, "We want to stay with our new family." The wedding ceremony was unlike anything Grace could have imagined, a blending of Pawnee traditions with adaptations that honored her white heritage, creating something entirely new while respecting both sources. She wore traditional Pawnee dress made by the women of the band, but she also carried wildflowers that reminded her of her sister's garden back east. As she and Swift Arrow exchanged vows, promises spoken in both English and Pawnee, witnessed by two communities that had become one, Grace thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had set out to deliver her sister's children to reluctant relatives, never imagining that she would find her own family among people she had been taught to fear. The years that followed were rich with challenges and discoveries. Grace learned Pawnee language and customs, while teaching English and white ways to anyone interested in learning. The children grew up truly bicultural, as comfortable with bow and arrow as with books, equally fluent in Pawnee and English, able to navigate both worlds with confidence and pride. Emma became a skilled negotiator who helped resolve conflicts between the band and white settlements. Tommy developed into a talented hunter and tracker who could read the desert like a book. Lucy grew into a young woman with her adopted father's wisdom and her aunt's determination, eventually becoming a medicine woman who combined Pawnee healing traditions with white medical knowledge. Grace and Swift Arrow had 3 more children together, 2 sons and a daughter who grew up considering Emma, Tommy, and Lucy their full siblings, never questioning the idea that families could be built on love rather than blood. When Grace died at the age of 68, her funeral was attended by both Pawnee and white communities throughout the territory. She had become a bridge between worlds, helping negotiated treaties, establishing trading relationships, and proving that understanding could grow from courage and respect. The story of the white woman who had carried 3 children through the desert and found a new life among the Pawnee became part of tribal legend, told around campfires as an example of how the spirits sometimes guided people to exactly where they needed to be, even when the path seemed impossible. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Grace's life was the continuing bond between her adopted and biological children, all of whom went on to build their own bridges between cultures, proving that the love she had demonstrated in the desert could multiply and spread, creating connections that transcended the boundaries that others saw as insurmountable. And in the desert where Grace had once stumbled forward with 3 dying children, not knowing if she would find salvation or death, travelers would sometimes spot the markers that Swift Arrow and his sons had placed, stones arranged to guide lost wanderers toward water and safety. A practical memorial to the truth that sometimes the most desperate journeys led to the most unexpected blessings.